For as long as the concept of religion has existed, there has always been the battle of the light against the dark. In the 20th century, one man was at the center of this battle and became an icon for modern occultism. He worked actively to create and contribute to the creation of religions and followings, and eventually became so famous that he became the figurehead of the occult community and a pioneer of the dark arts. On this week's episode, we're going to discuss the life, practices, and legacy of the man known simply as Aleister Crowley. So stay with us, because the story of Mr. Crowley is coming up. Hello everyone, and I'd like to welcome you back to a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. As always, I'm your host Nick, and on this week's episode, we're going to explore the life of Aleister Crowley. Ensure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss any of our weekly episodes. Now it's time to turn out your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen. Maybe you're alone, but maybe you're not. Now, follow the sound of my voice as we travel back to the 1870s to meet the man known as Mr. Crowley. Edward Alexander Crowley was born on the 12th of October in 18... He was the son of Edward Crowley, a trained engineer whose true passion was with their family business, Crowley's Alton Ales. Crowley's mother, Emily Bishop, and he did not have a good relationship. She would continually refer to him as the Beast, which was a name he took to heart. Both his mother and father were evangelical Christians and heavily involved in their religion. His father, in retirement, would spend his time traveling around and preaching the word of the Lord. Each and every morning, he would read a passage from the Bible to Edward and his mother Emily at the breakfast table. In 1880, when Edward Jr. was 5 years old, his baby sister would pass away. The family would relocate to a town in Surrey in 1881. By the age of 8 years old, he would be sent to an evangelical boarding school in Hastings, followed by a prep school in Cambridge. While at Abor Prep School, Edward Jr.'s headmaster was Reverend Henry Champney, who was considered a sadist. Unfortunately for Edward Jr., his father would pass away from tongue cancer in March of 1887. This would mark a pivotal point in the life of Edward. He had always admired his father, looking up to him as a hero and a friend. As a result of his father's passing, Edward inherited about a third of his father's total wealth. Historian Ronald Hutton would describe Crowley during his youth as self-indulgent and flamboyant. He was a young man who set about a deliberate flouting and provocation of social and religious norms. He was shielded from public opinion because of his outrageous wealth. He had an unappeasable desire to take control of all situations and would quarrel savagely with those who challenged him. Albert would contract the disease known as albuminuria, a pathological condition that causes protein to be found in the urine. Because of this, his mother removed him from the boarding school. He would be placed in the local schools, Malvern College, and Tunbridge School, which he despised and only lasted a few semesters. In his teen years, Edward would become skeptical of Christianity due to inconsistencies in biblical text. His morals would divert from those of a traditional Christian. He took up smoking, masturbation, and would even hire prostitutes for sexual gratification. Unfortunately for Edward, this would lead to him contracting gonorrhea. To finish his schooling, he would be sent to Eastbourne College, where he developed interests in chess, poetry, and mountain climbing. In 1895, he would go on to attend Trinity College in Cambridge, where he mainly studied humanities. It was at this time he would adopt the use of the name Aleister over his given name of Edward. Of this, he said the following: "For many years, I loathed it being called Alec, partly because of the unpleasant sound and slight of the word, partly because it was the name by which my mother called me. Edward did not seem to suit me, and the diminutives Ted or Ned were even less appropriate. Alexander was too long, and Sandy suggested tow hair and freckles. I had read, in some book or other, that the most favorable name for becoming famous was one consisting of a dactyl followed by a spondee, as at the end of a hexameter, like Jeremy Taylor. Aleister Crowley fulfilled these conditions, and Aleister is the Gaelic form of Alexander. To adopt it would satisfy my romantic ideals." Eventually, he would change his focus to English literature and became more engaged in the university. He became president of the college's chess team, practicing up to 2 hours a day. He found a great love in literature and poetry. The works of Richard Francis Button and Percy Shelley were among his favorites. Many of Aleister's own writings would even be published in the local media. His love of mountain climbing would see him take trips to the Swiss Alps every year between 1894 and 1898, often sharing the journey with his friend, Oscar Eckstein. Crowley's first brush with the occult came in 1896 while on a trip to Stockholm. It is widely believed by many who have researched his life that during this trip, Aleister had his first homosexual experience, which would lead him into bisexuality. Nonetheless, he would maintain a steady course of heterosexual experiences, still largely with prostitutes. In October of 1897, Aleister would meet Herbert Pollitt, the president of the Cambridge University Drama Club, with whom he would enter into a relationship, which, at this time in history, was illegal. The relationship would not last long, as Pollitt and Crowley did not see eye to eye. Mostly on the subject of Western esotericism, this would scar Crowley for the next few years. Following this, he would travel to Russia and visit St. Petersburg. He was attempting to learn Russian for a possible future career as a diplomat. There, he would contract an illness that led him to abandon his dreams of politics and instead focus more on his fascination with the occult. In March of 1898, he would pick up a copy of A.E. Waite's The Book of Black Magic and Pacts. In addition, he would also read a copy of Karl von Eckartshausen's The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. Both of these works had a large premise of dealing with the occult. He would also publish a series of poems related to eroticism that were not accepted for publishing in England. He would leave Cambridge University officially in July of 1898. He did not receive a degree from the university, even though he showed strong academics, even achieving second-class honors. While in Switzerland, in 1898, Crowley would meet a chemist named Julian Baker. When the pair returned to London, Crowley would be introduced to a man named George Cecil Jones, a relative of Baker's, and a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This was considered a magical order and a secret society dedicated to the practice of the occult, metaphysics, and the paranormal. He was initiated into the Outer Order in November of 1898 at the Isis Urania Temple in London by the group's leader Samuel Mathers. It was with the Golden Dawn where he would give himself the name Frater Perdurabo, which meant I shall endure to the end. After his induction, Crowley would move into a luxury apartment and invite senior members of the order, like Alan Bennett, to live with him as his magical tutor. Among the things he learned with Bennett was the drug-induced ritual of Gosha. The ritual is outlined in the book known as the Lesser Key of Solomon. It is a ritual by which to invoke demons. It was considered to be pure evil and heretical. In November of 1899, he would purchase Boleskine House, a property on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland, due to his love for Scottish culture. After this, he would take to wearing traditional Highland garb. As Crowley progressed through the lower ranks of the order, he made ready to enter the inner, Second Order. Unfortunately, who he was clashed with other members of the order. His bisexuality and libertine lifestyle gained him a bad reputation. He would be refused entry into the Second Order, which caused him to visit the group's leader in Paris, who initiated him into the Adeptus Minor grade. Tensions began to flare between the London group and Mathers in Paris. Mathers would order Crowley and his mistress, Elaine Simpson, to seize the Vault of the Adepts from the members in London. Unfortunately, this would be unsuccessful, as the courts would rule in favor of the Londoners, leaving Crowley and Mathers outcast. In 1900, he would travel to Mexico, settling in Mexico City. He struck up a relationship with a local woman and continued his experiments with ceremonial magic, especially with incantations. It was in Mexico City that Crowley would claim to have been initiated into the Freemasons. His friend Eckenstein would join him there later that year, but they were forced to leave Mexico due to a volcanic eruption. So they headed for Hawaii by way of San Francisco, sailing aboard the Nippon Maru. While aboard, Crowley fell in love with a married woman named Mary Alice Rogers. When he arrived, he met with his old mentor Alan Bennett, who was studying Shaivism, the Hindu practice of worship to the goddess Shiva. Bennett would soon leave their company, heading to Burma to become a monk. In 1902, Crowley would venture with his friends on a K2 expedition. This was special, as they would have been the first to summit this mountain, but were forced to turn back at 20,000 feet when their party was hit with illness. In November of that year, he arrived back in Paris, where he would meet Gerald Kelly. Through Kelly's connections, Crowley would become a major player in the Paris arts scene. In 1903, he would return to his home in Scotland. That August, he would marry Kelly's sister Rose. The key piece here was that it was a marriage that allowed Rose to avoid having an arranged marriage to someone else. This infuriated the Kelly family and hindered Crowley's relationship with Gerald. The couple would honeymoon in Paris and Cairo and finally Ceylon. During this trip, Crowley fell genuinely in love with Rose and wrote her a series of poems to prove his affection. In 1904, Crowley and Rose arrived in Cairo under the guise of being a prince and princess. In their apartment, Crowley set up a temple room and would attempt invoking ancient Egyptian deities. Rose would become delirious during this period and inform him that they were waiting for him. She would go on to explain that they was the god Horus, and that the equinox of the gods would soon come. Rose would bring him to a local museum and show him the exhibit of the Stela of Ang-If and Kansu. Curious enough, the exhibit's number was 666, the number of the beast. On the 8th of April, he claimed to have heard the voice of Aiwass, the messenger of Horus. Everything the messenger said to Crowley, he documented in the book Liber Alvaligus, or the Book of Law in English. Of the few ideas to be introduced in the book was that humanity was entering into a new era, or aeon in the book's vernacular, and Crowley would serve as its prophet or harbinger. In this new aeon, humanity would be free to live under whatever morals an individual so decided. This ideology would help form Crowley's new religion known as Thelema. He was unsure what to do with the Book of Law and often disregarded the instructions he was told to perform. Among those were the recovering of the stelae, fortifying his own island, and translating the book into all the world's languages. He would send typescripts of this work to many of his occult followers and then put the book away, ignoring it altogether. The Crowleys returned to Boleskine in 1905. Aleister started to believe that Samuel Mathers had started using magic against him, and their relationship broke down. On the 28th of July, Rose gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Lilith. Aleister would found a publishing company called the Society for the Propagation of Religious Truth, a means to publish his own poetry and mock the society for promoting Christian knowledge. Although Crowley's poetry received a great amount of praise, it never did well fiscally. Around this time, he would lead a party on an expedition to summit Kanchenjunga, a treacherous mountain in the Himalayas. Those who attended would eventually mutiny against Crowley's lead and left the expedition during nightfall one evening. Unfortunately for them, they went against Crowley's warnings that it would be too dangerous and a few people would lose their lives in the incident. Crowley was eventually blamed for the loss of life by the mountaineering community. He would next head to the town of Mohabbanj, where he would smoke opium and spend a great deal of time on spiritual and magical works. There, he would religiously recite the Bornless ritual as a way to invoke his guardian angel. Rose and Lilith would return to Europe while Aleister would head to Shanghai. There, he met up with his old friend and love interest Elaine Simpson, who was truly fascinated by his work with the Book of Law. Together, they would perform a ritual as an attempt to contact Aiwass. He would then travel to Japan and then Canada, eventually arriving in New York City, where he was unsuccessful at garnering support for another mountaineering expedition. When he returned to England, he was met with the devastating news that his daughter Lilith had died of typhoid while traveling through Rangoon. In a fit of hysterics, Crowley would blame this death on Rose's alcoholistic tendencies. While emotionally devastated, his health began to decline, leading to a series of surgeries. He had begun to have extramarital affairs with a woman named Vera Neville and Ada Leverson. All the while, Rose gave birth to their second daughter, Lola Zaza, in February 1907. He would recommence ritualistic practices with his old mentor, George Cecil Jones. In doing this, Crowley believed that he had achieved union with God, the foundation for another turning point in his life. He would experiment with the drug hashish in these rituals and eventually proclaimed it the drug to aid in mysticism. He would again claim to make further contact with Aiwass, eventually compiling those works in the Holy Books of Thelema. When he rediscovered the Book of Law at Boleskine in 1909, he began to believe that his religion, Thelema, represented objective truth. It was around this time that Crowley's inheritance from his father's passing was beginning to run out. In an effort to gather funds, he was hired by the Earl of Tankerville to help protect him from witchcraft. Crowley discovered that the source of this paranoia was from cocaine addiction, and Crowley brought him with him on a trip to France and Morocco to dry out. He also began instructing students in the occult and magics. Aleister would begin to take on a new sexual partner as well, Victor Newberg, who was his closest disciple at the time. Newberg would travel with Crowley to Boleskine, where the two would engage in sadomasochism. While there, he continued writing books and papers. He was also fortunate enough to have a few of his articles published in Vanity Fair, a magazine edited by his friend Frank Harris. In November 1907, Crowley and Jones decided to start their own occult order to replace the Golden Dawn. This would lead to the foundation of the Arcanum Arcanorum, or the AA for short. Their headquarters were situated in central London, and their rituals were somewhat similar to that of the Golden Dawn, but focused on Crowley's Thelemic religion. The earliest memberships attracted some notable people: solicitors, artists, and engineers. In March of 1909, Crowley would release his first biannual publication called The Equinox. He would become increasingly intolerant of his wife's alcoholism and divorced her that November on the grounds of adultery. Lola would be entrusted into Rose's care, and Rose continued to reside at Boleskine, and the two did remain friends. Unfortunately for Rose, her tendencies of alcohol abuse continued, so much so that she was institutionalized in 1911. Traveling to Algeria in late 1909, Crowley would begin his study of the Quran, reciting passages on a daily basis. He had begun to experiment with Enochian magic, or invoking the aethers. He would attempt a sex magic ritual on top of a mountain, which he would attempt to summon the demon Choronzon. This involved a blood sacrifice, and Crowley viewed this as a great moment in his magic career. On his return to London in 1910, Crowley would be sued by his former mentor Samuel Mathers for publishing the secrets of the Golden Dawn. Crowley would eventually win this suit, leading him to gaining international renown and greater fame. He would embrace the labels of being a Satanist and a staunch advocate for human sacrifice, of which he truly was neither. This lawsuit would spark a greater interest in the AA, attracting many new and prominent members. Crowley, wanting to appeal to a larger audience, would create the Rites of Artemis, a publicly displayed performance of magic and symbolism. The first event would be held at the group's headquarters, with its members being given fruit punch laced with peyote in order to enhance the experience. With some members of the press also attending, it gained fairly positive reviews. Expanding on that success, Crowley would create a stage show, The Rites of Eleusis, which was not nearly as well reviewed. He had begun to draw the ire of a local newspaper named The Looking Glass, and would be labeled as one of the most blasphemous and cold-blooded villains of modern times. Drawing negative attention, Crowley would head to France in 1911, where he would write 19 different works on magic and mysticism, including the final 2 holy books of Thelema. It would be in Paris that he would meet Mary d'Este, his next Scarlet Woman, who believed he could channel Ab-ul-Diz, who was a secret chief in the workings of the magical St. Moritz. It was through his conversations with Ab-ul-Diz that Crowley would develop the spelling of magic with an added K on the end. This was in order to distinguish genuine magic from that of stage magic or illusion. In the early parts of 1912, Crowley would publish the Book of Lies. This was viewed as his greatest work as it combined his talents in poetry, scholarly work, and magics. Theodore Royce, the founder of the occult order known as the Ordo Templi Orientis, accused Crowley of publishing his order's secrets in the book. Crowley, however, would convince Royce that their similarities were a victim of circumstance and the differences were quickly set aside. Crowley would gain a high standing in the OTO, being appointed the head of the order's British branch known as the Mysteria Mystica Maxima. He was invested at a ceremony in Berlin and adopted the magical name of Baphomet. Crowley would next set out, with the blessing of Royce, and rewrite many of the OTO's rituals and would incorporate many elements of his own religion, Thelema. By 1913, Crowley was working as a producer for the Ragged Ragtime Girls, a group of violinists in London. This would eventually take him to Moscow, where he developed a sadomasochistic relationship with a Hungarian woman. Here, he would develop the Gnostic Mass, a Thelemic ritual that would become a key component of the OTO's liturgy. In 1914, he and Newberg would return to Paris during a 6-week period in which they would create the Paris Working. This was an intense ritual centered on drug-induced sex magic in order to invoke the gods Mercury and Jupiter. Crowley and Newberg would eventually get into an argument, leading to being cursed by Crowley. After this disagreement, the two men would distance themselves from one another. By 1914 and the outbreak of World War I, Crowley was living a meager existence. He struggled to buy the basic life necessities and relied on donations from his AA and OTO members. Due to his financial struggle, he was forced to sign over ownership of Boleskine House to the OTO. He would travel to the United States aboard the RMS Lusitania in October of 1914, where he arrived in New York City. Here, he would make a living writing articles for Vanity Fair and doing freelance work for astrologer Evangeline Adams. He would continue his practices with sex magic and documented all encounters in his diaries. Claiming to be of Irish ancestry and a supporter of the Irish struggle for independence against Britain, Crowley started to garner support for Germany during World War I. Becoming visible in the pro-German movement, he was recruited by German spy George Friedrich in 1915 to write his propaganda-laden newspaper, The Fatherland, which was committed to U.S. neutrality in the war. Because of this alignment, Britain would label Crowley as a traitor. Through this, he would meet Jean Foster, with whom he toured the U.S. West Coast and developed a relationship. He would also travel to Canada, as the North American headquarters of the OTO was in Vancouver. He would use his connections here through Charles Jones and Wilfred Smith to push the concept of Thelema in North America. He and Jean would continue their travels through the western part of the continent for a time before returning to New York. In April of 1916, he would meet Alice Richardson and her husband, Ananda. Crowley and Alice would engage in a ritual of sex magic, causing her to become pregnant, but unfortunately miscarry. Following this, he would take a magical retirement, during which time he continued a heavy bout of drug use and would name himself Master Therion. That December, he would move to New Orleans, which was his favorite U.S. city, and then travel to Florida the following year to spend the winter with his relatives. Later that year, he would return to New York and, needing financial support, he moved in with AA member Leon Angers Kennedy. The Fatherland newspaper would collapse, but Crowley and Viereck would continue their relationship, with the former being named as the editor of The International, an arts journal. Crowley would use this as an opportunity to promote Thelema, which caused the journal to cease publication shortly thereafter. He would soon meet his new partner, Roddy Minor. Through their practice of sex magic, he would create the Amalantra workings, which would help him contact a preternatural entity named Lam, a relationship that would end almost as quickly as it began. In 1918, Crowley attended a retreat near the Hudson River. He would focus on translating the Tao Te Ching, an ancient Chinese text, and painted thelematic verses on riverside cliffs. During the retreat, and likely due to ritualistic drug use, Crowley would claim to have experienced memories of He Wan, Pope Alexander VI, Alessandro Cagliostro, and Eliphas Levi. On his return to New York, he would move to Greenwich Village and again take a new lover in Leah Herzig. He began to paint and was even featured at the Greenwich Village Liberal Club. Crowley, with financial assistance from the Freemasons, would revive the Equinox publication. He would spend a good part of 1919 on a climbing holiday in Montauk before returning to London later in the year. Crowley was not well received when he returned to London. He was attacked by tabloids for his pro-German involvement in the US. When Crowley had begun to suffer from asthma, he was prescribed heroin by a doctor, which subsequently became addicted to. In January of 1920, he and Leah moved to Paris, renting a house in Fontainebleau. The couple would eventually become a trio, bringing in Nanette Shumway into their relationship. Crowley would eventually begin to formulate the idea of creating a community of Thelemites, which he would house in the Abbey of Thelema. For this, he would choose Cefalu, a town in Sicily, for its location, and on the 2nd of April would rent an old villa named the Via Santa Barbara. Moving to this place with Leah, Nanette, and their children, Crowley would become perfectly happy, viewing this situation as his idea of heaven. The family would all wear robes and perform rituals to the Egyptian sun god Ra at various times of the day. He would occasionally perform the Gnostic Mass, and, when not engaged in prayer and ritual, everyone was free to pursue their own interests. Crowley offered a libertine education for his children, allowing them to play all day long, but they were forced to bear witness to sex magic. He would occasionally travel to Palermo to visit male prostitutes, buy supplies for the abbey, and restock his drugs. Unfortunately for Crowley, his addiction to heroin and cocaine began to take over his life. The abbey was never cleaned, which caused wild cats and dogs to wander throughout the building. Even in the dilapidated state that it was in, the abbey continued to attract new followers. Most prominent among them was the actress Jane Wolfe, who would eventually become Crowley's secretary. He would return to Paris in February of 1922 in an unsuccessful attempt to curb his own heroin addiction. From there, he traveled to London in an attempt to drum up new funding. Two of the followers to attend the abbey were Raoul Loveday and his wife Betty. While Raoul was entirely devout to Crowley, Betty absolutely despised the man and life at the abbey in general. Betty would later attest that Raoul was forced to drink the blood of a sacrificed cat. They would even be forced to cut themselves with razor blades if they used the pronoun I. His thelematic practice would eventually cost Raoul his life after drinking from a polluted stream. Betty would tell all of these things to the tabloid John Bull, who would label Crowley as the wickedest man in the world, and a man we'd like to hang. Crowley took offense to this, considering it to be slanderous, but unfortunately didn't have the capital to fight a legal battle with the tabloid. John Bull would continue to flood Europe and North America with stories of Crowley, eventually leading to Benito Mussolini and the Italian government to take notice of his activities. He would be given a deportation notice in April of 1923. Without Crowley, the abbey was forced to close. Throughout 1923 and 24, Crowley would continue to struggle with his heroin addiction, failing to break it on multiple occasions. He would also begin writing his autobiography titled The Confessions of Aleister Crowley and traveled to Tunis, Paris, and London. He would continue to practice sex magic and even wrote his book To Man, which declared his status as a prophet and was entrusted to bring Thelema to humanity. He would find a new lover in an American follower named Dorothy Olson, with whom he would father a child, leading to his wife Leah to leave him. Royce, the leader of the OTO, would pass away, and Crowley proclaimed that he had been named Royce's successor prior to his death. This was challenged by a German member named Heinrich Tanker. Tranker would then call the Hohenloeben Conference in Germany, in which Crowley would also attend. The membership votes were split between Crowley and Tranker, which caused an absolute split in the OTO. He moved back to Paris in 1926 and split with Olson. He would take a number of lovers over the next few years and with the ritualistic practice of sex magic. His addictions to drugs would cause those years to be plagued by a great decline in his health. Crowley would begin to meet a few friends who would help him turn his life around, but none of which would subscribe to Thelema. Crowley would write the book Magic in Theory and Practice, which went relatively unknown at the time, but has since today become one of his most significant works. In December of 1928, Crowley met a Nicaraguan woman named Maria Sanchez, but was subsequently deported from France, for they feared him to be a German agent. He married Maria in 1929 so that they could live together in Britain. In 1920, Crowley would move to Berlin, finding a magical partner in Hanne Jaeger. He would travel to Portugal that same year, where he decided to fake his own death, but would return to Berlin 3 weeks later for the opening of his art exhibition. In 1931, he would meet Bertha Bush, a lover with whom he had a very physically abusive relationship, causing him to have other affairs with both men and women. In January of 1932, he met Gerald Hamilton, who introduced him to many figures within the Berlin far left. And it might have been believed that Crowley was working as a spy for British intelligence at this time. Leaving Bush behind, Crowley would return to London, taking again a new lover in Pearl Brooksmith. In 1932, he was invited to be a guest of honor at Foyle's Literary Luncheon at the invitation of famed psychic researcher Harry Price. Price would invite Crowley to speak at the National Laboratory of Psychical Research. Finally, having a decent financial footing, Crowley would launch a series of lawsuits against those who had libeled him. Some of these, but not all, were successful. Unfortunately, this endeavor would not be as successful as he envisioned, causing him to declare bankruptcy in February of 1935. During his bankruptcy hearing, it was discovered that Crowley had been spending 3 times his income for several years. In 1936, he struck up a friendship with Deidre Doherty, who offered to carry a child for him. Their son, named Randall, was born in May of 1937. Crowley continued to socialize with his friends and would eventually publish his book, The Equinox of the Gods. This book sold extremely well and was even granted a second print run. After the release of the book, Crowley came to be financially supported by the branch of the OTO in California, led by rocket scientist Jack Parsons. He began to become intrigued by the rise of Nazism in Germany. Through his friend Martha Kunzel, he believed he might even be able to convert Adolf Hitler to Thelema. Unfortunately for Crowley, Nazi Germany would abolish the German branch of the OTO. Crowley would speak out against Hitler, calling him a black magician. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Crowley would contact British Naval Intelligence Division to offer his services in espionage, which they would later decline. He would rub elbows with some in the intelligence community, however, such as the likes of Roald Dahl, Ian Fleming, and Maxwell Knight. Crowley also had laid claim to being behind the development of the V for Victory sign, although this was never proven. In 1940, his asthmatic condition would take a turn for the worse. He was no longer able to procure his German medication, which had caused him to turn back to heroin, furthering his addiction. When the Blitz began to bombard London, he relocated to Torquay and was hospitalized due to complications from asthma. He would return to London following the Blitz and again focus on the OTO. With one of his initiates, Frieda Harris, he had envisioned plans of producing tarot cards. Over the war years, he would continue aiding the war effort through proclamations on human rights and being a champion for the liberation of France. In April of 1944, he would move to the village of Aston Clinton in Buckinghamshire, followed by the move to Hastings, where he moved into the Netherwood boarding house. He would take on a man named Kenneth Grant as his secretary, promising to pass on magical knowledge rather than traditional wage payment. Here, he would begin corresponding with Gerald Gardner, the future founding member of Gardnerian Wicca. They quickly became close friends, and Crowley authorized Gardner to revive the British chapter of the OTO. On the 1st of December 1947, at the age of 72, Crowley would take his final breath due to chronic bronchitis that was aggravated by pleurisy and an advanced stage of myocardial degeneration. His funeral would be held at the Brighton Crematorium on the 5th of December and was only attended by about a dozen people. He had a ceremony largely based in Thelema, and many excerpts were read from the Gnostic Mass ritual, as well as various passages from the Book of Law. The funeral stirred up a great press controversy and was labeled as a black mass. Crowley's ashes were sent to Carl Germer in the United States, who buried them in his garden. Crowley's final resting place is in Hampton, New Jersey. So with the death of Crowley, let's examine some of his personal beliefs. We'll begin with the foundations for his concept of his beliefs, which was Thelema. Thelema was viewed as a new religious movement that could be characterized as a form of modern paganism. The Book of Law, which was the basis for Thelema, did not gain much traction until many years after it was written. Crowley's purpose for bringing Thelema into the world was to bring an ancient wisdom to Europe and restore paganism to its proper form. The concepts of Thelema were not always cohesive due to Crowley's experiences with various religious movements, magic, alchemy, astrology, and many other occult forms of practice. There was a belief that some of the concepts for his sex magic were drawn from the practices of Tantra. Crowley believed that the 20th century was to begin humanity's travel into a new era through the Aeon of Horus, which he decided he would be the prophet. Largely, the belief was that humanity would discover true will and would realize their true purpose and calling through the use of the Abramelin operation, an ancient ceremonial magic ritual. Crowley truly believed in the existence of magic. He believed that it was the link between science and art causing a change in human will. Magic would ultimately connect humans with entities that lived on a higher plane through the use of mysticism. Magic would also be a connector between religion and science, leading Crowley and his followers to embrace the scientific method and retain detailed records of their rituals and experiments. He viewed magic and science as linked, believing that ancient magics were the foundation for modern science. Sexuality, of course, played an important role in this and was a central Thelemic religious theme. It was believed that the use of sex magic could focus a person's will and such things like goal realization or financial gain. It was treated as a sacrament, and even the consumption of sexual fluids was akin to that of the Eucharist. It was relatively unknown what Crowley's theological beliefs actually were. Some believed him to be an atheist, while others a polytheist. Throughout his life, Crowley was labeled as a Satanist. He did not believe he was, as he did not subscribe to the views of Christianity. In some of his writings, however, Crowley would label the god Iwis as something similar to Satan. He did adopt satanic imagery and would call himself such things as the Beast 666. For his political beliefs, Crowley enjoyed throwing out the concept of conventional morality, being in revolt against the moral and religious beliefs of the time. He was neither a liberal nor a conservative, but more so a conservative revolutionary. He had a great fascination with Nazism and Marxist-Leninism due to the anti-Christian positions. Due to their subversive nature, he saw opportunities to annihilate ancient traditions and would install the views of Thelema in their absence. Crowley himself was also bisexual but tended to gravitate more towards women with an interest in exotic women. He advocated for sexual freedom and threw off the notions that people should be ashamed of their sexual preference. He was the true embodiment of an upper-class individual and held deeply racist viewpoints, although, again, he was fascinated with people of color. He has been accused of sexism and exhibited general misogyny, which is believed to have come from the breakdown of the relationship with his mother. He believed women to be morally inferior and treated them with firmness, kindness, and justice. To this day, Aleister Crowley is still an influential person in the fields of occult and popular culture, especially in Britain. He was labeled as the 73rd greatest Briton in a 2002 BBC poll and labeled as the best equipped magician since the 17th century. He was the greatest modern occultist and represented the dark side of the occult. He played a crucial and important part in the history of Western response to Oriental and spiritual traditions. With the legacy of Aleister Crowley being so dark and mysterious, many of us, like Ozzy Osbourne, are left to wonder, Mr. Crowley, what went on in your head? If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of this week's story about the wickedest man in the world, Aleister Crowley. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. For more information about the podcast, please visit our Linktree in the show notes. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review so you don't miss any of the weekly episodes to come. If you liked this episode, please tell a friend about the Insidious Agenda podcast. If you'd like to show your support, Donations can be made to our PayPal in the link tree. So come back next week as we discuss the terrifying story of the haunting of the Smurl family. New episodes release every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.